In England in the 16th century, many people were not very sympathetic to the poor. For instance, a law of 1530 said that the old and disabled could be given a license to beg. However, there were also vagabonds, people without a job roaming the country. The law said that vagabonds should be tied to a cart and whipped. In 1601, the Poor Law was created. Local officials were given the power to levy a local tax to give relief to the poor, but they were supposed to find work for the able-bodied. It's thought that in the 16th century and 17th century, about half the population of England lived at subsistence level, that is bare survival level, or below it. The poor lived mainly on bread, and the poorest families lived in one room. Slightly better off families might live in 2 or 3 rooms. Things changed little in the 18th century. Again, about half the population were living at subsistence level. In a pre-industrial society, most people had a very low standard of living. Only a tiny upper class and a small middle class lived in comfort. Merry England is a fantasy. Most people were very poor, their lives were hard and disease was rife. Workhouses were first built in England in the 17th century, but they became far more common in the 18th century. As the name suggests, they were used to house the poor, but they were supposed to do some kind of work. The workhouses went on until the early 20th century, when they were gradually replaced by benefits. In 1903, the writer Jack London wrote a book called People of the Abyss, in which he described poverty in workhouses in London. Conditions were horrid. At the beginning of the 20th century, a man named Booth published a survey that showed that about 30% of the population of London were living at subsistence level, or below it. A man named Rowntree did a similar survey in York. It showed that about 28% of the population of the city were living in poverty. According to his survey, about 18% were living at subsistence level and 10% were living below it. Surveys in other towns in Britain in the early 20th century showed a similar picture. At least 25% of the population were living at subsistence level or below it. In 1900, the main cause of poverty was very low wages, much lower than today. Obviously, prices were much lower too. However, relative to people's income, food especially was much more expensive than it is today. Having said all that, things were improving by the early 20th century. The number of people living at subsistence level had been cut, and living standards for ordinary people were rising. A survey in Liverpool in 1928 showed that 14% of the population were living at subsistence level, or below it. That might not be representative of Britain as a whole, because Liverpool was a low-income city. A survey in London in 1929-1930 showed that about 10% of the population were living at subsistence level. An earlier survey, carried out in 1924, showed that about 4% of the population were living below subsistence level. So things had certainly improved by the 1920s, but there was still severe hardship. In the early 20th century, there used to be something called the Boot Fund, to provide boots and shoes to children whose parents couldn't afford them. In the 1980s, an elderly gentleman told me that when he was a boy in the 1920s, he remembered seeing boys playing in the street bare feet, because their parents couldn't afford shoes. During the 1930s, things improved again. By 1936, a survey showed that just under 4% of the population were living at subsistence level. The main cause of poverty in the 1930s was unemployment. Having said that, a man on the dole in 1936 was about as well off as an unskilled worker in 1906, 30 years earlier, because living standards had risen so much. Things improved again in the 1940s when a Labour government created a modern welfare state. In the 1950s, Britain became an affluent society, and by the 1960s, ordinary people in Britain had a standard of living undreamed of in past ages. Of course, in the 1960s, there was still relative poverty. Some people had substantially less than the average income. To a 19th century person, they wouldn't seem poor, but they were poor relative to the average person in their day. Once consumer goods like fridges, washing machines and telephones became common, if you didn't own one, you were poor. I mean, obviously you wouldn't seem poor to a person from the 18th century, but by the standards of your society you were poor. In the 1980s, inequality in Britain began to grow again. Today, many people in Britain rely on food banks, which have become common. In this video, I have talked about poverty in Britain, but I will end by saying that in the last 20 years, the amount of extreme poverty in the world has greatly declined. Well, thanks for watching.